Fix it in 7 hours, the big man said, his voice so flat it didn't even sound like a threat. Or don't waste our time. Caleb Ward was 19 years old, standing in a garage that smelled like old oil and unpaid bills, staring at a 1947 Harley knucklehead that 5 professional shops had already refused to touch. Outside engines idled like a gathering storm. He didn't know yet that the bike wasn't broken. He didn't know yet that it was built to kill. If this story already has your heart beating faster, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop your city in the comments below so I can see how far this story travels, and don't you dare go anywhere. Because what happens in the next 7 hours will change everything. The morning Caleb Ward's life changed forever started the same way every morning started badly. He was under the hood of a '94 Chevy pickup that belonged to a dry cleaner named Mr. Figuera, the third time that same truck had come back for the same problem, and Caleb was sweating through his shirt by 8 in the morning. Because the Central Valley didn't care what kind of night you'd had. The heat came anyway. The bills came anyway. The doubts came loudest of all. The garage had been his Uncle Raymond's. Raymond Ward had built it from nothing, a single-base shop on the flat edge of Fresno, where the city slowly became farmland, where the street lights got sparse and the dogs ran loose at night. Uncle Raymond had taught Caleb everything: how to listen to an engine, the way you'd listen to somebody talking around the truth, how to feel the difference between a part that was wearing out and a part that was giving up. Raymond had hands like 2 sledgehammers and a laugh like a busted exhaust, and he'd been dead 14 months, and he'd left Caleb the garage because there was nobody else to leave it to. Caleb had 2 part-time guys who sometimes showed up and sometimes didn't. He had equipment that was mostly held together by habit. He had a ledger that, if he was honest, and he was always honest even when it hurt, showed him slipping backward by about $800 a month. The Chevy pickup was supposed to be a 2-hour job. It was now a 4-hour job and climbing. His phone buzzed. Electric bill. He put it face down on the workbench. You need to eat something. That was Darnell, the older of his 2 part-timers, 53 years old, built like a retired linebacker, who had worked with Uncle Raymond for 11 years and stayed on out of something that wasn't quite loyalty and wasn't quite pity, but lived somewhere between the two. Darnell was eating a breakfast burrito by the side door and watching Caleb the way you watch somebody walking too close to the edge of something. I'm fine, Caleb said. You said that yesterday, and I was fine yesterday. You were not fine yesterday. You were cranky and pale, and you knocked over the parts bin twice. I was distracted. You were hungry. Darnell held out half the burrito. Take it. Caleb took it. He ate standing up, not because he was in a hurry, but because sitting down felt like giving in to something, and he couldn't afford to give in to anything right now. He was looking at the calendar on the wall. Raymond's old calendar, still the same one in 1987 promotional calendar from a parts supplier that had been out of business for 20 years, and he was doing the math he did every morning. Rent on the building due in 11 days, equipment loan payment in 16. The Chevy pickup would pay for neither of those things. We need a big job, Caleb said. We need a miracle, Darnell said. Neither of them knew how right he was. The sound came first. Not a roar, not the Hollywood thunder that people who'd never been around serious bikes always imagined. It was something lower and more controlled than that, a deep synchronized rumble that you felt in the floor before you heard it properly, like the earth clearing its throat. Caleb heard it and didn't think much of it. Bikes came through the valley. Bikes stopped for gas. Bikers sometimes needed work done and sometimes didn't trust a shop that looked like his. He'd had a few in over the years, mostly routine stuff. Then Darnell walked to the bay door and looked out, and Darnell, who had seen considerable things in 53 years, went very quiet. Caleb, he said, come here. The tone was enough. Caleb set down the burrito wrapper and walked to the door, and he understood immediately why Darnell had gone quiet. It wasn't one bike or two. It wasn't a small crew passing through. They came around the corner in formation, clean and deliberate, and they kept coming. Black leather, chrome-worn denim. Patches he recognized from a distance, the red and white of the Hells Angels, the Death's Head grinning from their backs, and they rolled into his lot like they'd already decided it belonged to them, which in that moment it absolutely did. Caleb counted 14, then lost count. They positioned themselves around the perimeter of the lot with a precision that was not accidental. This wasn't a stop, this was an arrival. The lead bike was a Road King, and the man who climbed off it was the largest human being Caleb had seen outside of a stadium. 6'2", maybe 6'3", 260 pounds of it, organized into the shape of a man in his late 40s who looked like he had been put together for a specific and serious purpose. Gray hair pulled back, a beard trimmed close, eyes the color of old motor oil, dark brown and completely unreadable. The patch on his chest said Sergeant at Arms. The patch below his name tag said Grip. He walked across the lot without hurrying. He didn't look at the garage or the equipment or the sign above the door. He looked at Caleb. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at Caleb the way you look at something you're deciding whether to buy or walk away from. "You Raymond Ward's nephew," he said. "Yes, sir." "You the one running this shop now?" "Yes, sir." Grip nodded slowly like he was confirming something he'd already suspected. "Raymond Ward was a straight man," he said. "Did good work. Didn't run his mouth." He paused. "You like him?" It was not a casual question. Caleb understood that. "I try to be," Caleb said. Another nod. Grip turned and made a small gesture with 2 fingers, and 2 men at the back of the group walked forward. Between them, they were rolling something, a motorcycle covered in a heavy canvas tarp, and they positioned it in the center of the lot with the care of men handling something that mattered. Grip reached down and pulled the tarp off in one motion. The bike underneath stopped Caleb's breath in his chest. A 1947 Harley-Davidson knucklehead, and even in whatever condition it was in, and he could already see it was not good, it was one of the most extraordinary machines Caleb had ever been in the same space with. The lines of it, the particular grace of a knucklehead engine, when you understood what you were looking at, the way 70-some years sat on it, like something earned rather than something endured. Even covered in grease, in what looked like recent damage, it had presence, the way certain people had presence, a quality that made the air around it different. Caleb crouched down and looked at it without touching it. He could see immediately that something was wrong. The geometry was off in ways that weren't consistent with age or road wear. But he needed to look closer. 5 shops already looked at it, Grip said, watching him. 5 shops said it couldn't be fixed, or wouldn't. Which was it couldn't or wouldn't, the question surprised Grip. Just barely, just a flicker behind those flat eyes, but Caleb caught it. "Mixture of both," Grip said. "Last one told us to part it out. Sell the engine separate." Caleb looked up. What was wrong with it according to them? "Frame integrity," said it was compromised beyond repair. Too old, too much stress, damaged welds failing throughout. Caleb looked back at the bike. He looked at the frame. He looked at the welds. Something moved at the back of his brain. A small, cold thing like a draft from a door that shouldn't be open. "Can I touch it?" he asked. "That's why we're here," Grip said. Caleb put his hands on the frame, and the cold feeling got colder. "Fix it in 7 hours," Grip said, "or don't waste our time." Caleb stood up. He looked at Grip, and then he looked at the 14 men arranged around his lot, and then he looked back at the bike, and he made the only decision he ever made about jobs, which was the one his uncle had taught him. If you can see what's wrong, you can fix what's wrong. And if you can't fix it, you say so. "I need to do a full inspection before I agree to anything," he said. "That's not negotiable." Grip looked at him for 3 seconds. "Fine. And I need my workspace clear. 1 person can stay and watch. The rest wait outside or ride around, I don't care. But I can't work with 14 people standing in my lot." That was the moment. He could feel it. Some of the men shifted. A couple of them looked at Grip. Grip looked at Caleb. "Manny stays," Grip said, nodding toward one of the men, shorter mid-40s, a face full of old worry. Everyone else perimeter. They moved. Quietly, no argument, no grumbling. They just moved. And that Caleb would think about later was maybe the first thing that should have told him how serious this was. 14 men don't move like that for nothing. Darnell appeared at Caleb's shoulder. "You sure about this?" "Not even a little bit," Caleb said quietly. "But look at that bike." Darnell looked at the bike. "Oh," he said, and then yeah. Caleb got his inspection light. He got his magnifying glass and old. One Raymond's the kind that folded into a metal case and had been on that workbench as long as Caleb could remember. He got his reference materials because a 1947 knucklehead was not a bike you worked on from memory, even if you'd studied it the way Caleb had studied it, the way he'd studied every bike that came through. Because Raymond had told him that the best mechanics didn't just fix the bike in front of them, they knew every bike that had ever been built. He started at the front and worked back, methodically, the way Raymond had taught him. You don't start with the problem everyone can see. You start at the beginning and you go to the end because problems hide, and they hide in the places you'd never think to look unless you were already looking at everything. The Manny Reyes he'd heard Grip say stood against the wall with his arms crossed and said nothing. Caleb noticed that Manny was watching the bike more than he was watching Caleb. There was something in the way Manny watched it. Tension that wasn't curiosity, tension that was something else. Front end, forks, headset bearings. Caleb worked quietly and steadily, making mental notes, occasionally running his hands along metal surfaces, the way his uncle had taught him, feeling for things that shouldn't be there. Inconsistencies in surface temperature, differentials that might indicate stress. He got to the steering head at 18 minutes. He stopped. He brought the inspection light closer. He brought out the magnifying glass. The cold thing in his brain got very cold indeed. He didn't say anything. He moved back to the rear of the frame. He found the first rear rail. He examined the welds. He moved to the second. By the time he stood up, he had a complete picture in his mind, and the picture was not of a broken motorcycle. It was of a murder weapon. "How long have you had this bike?" Caleb asked. His voice came out level. He was proud of that. Grip looked over from where he'd been standing at the edge of the bay. "Came into our possession about 3 weeks ago." "Why?" "Who wrote it last?" Something shifted on Grip's face. Not much, but it shifted. "Why?" "I need to understand the writing history to do my job properly," Caleb said, which was true and also wasn't the whole truth. "Brother of mine wrote it," Grip said, "twice, short distances. Then we started having the handling complaints, took it to the first shop." "What were the handling complaints?" "Wobble in the front end, felt loose, soft, wrong." Caleb nodded. "Okay." He put down his magnifying glass and looked at Manny Reyes. Manny was staring at the floor. "Can I have a minute alone with the bike?" Caleb said. "No," Grip said from the doorway. "I'm not going to touch anything you haven't already seen me touch. I just need to think. Think out loud." Caleb considered that for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Here's what I'm seeing." He crouched down beside the steering head. "Come here." Grip walked over. He crouched too, with more difficulty. Big men didn't crouch easily, and looked where Caleb was pointing. "See this weld here, right at the steering head junction, left side?" "I see it." "What does it look like to you?" Grip looked at it for a long moment. "Looks solid." "It looks solid," Caleb agreed. "It was designed to look solid, but look at the penetration on the edges here and here." He held the inspection light steady. "This weld was done in layers. The top layer is cosmetically clean. The substrate layers are not fused properly. If you put this bike at highway speed around a curve or over a bump, you get vibration resonance at the steering head. The top layer fractures and the bike goes down. The rider doesn't walk away from that." Grip was very still. "The rear rails are the same," Caleb said. "Both of them. 3 points on this frame have been deliberately compromised using welding technique that disguises itself as normal repair work." He stood up. "Somebody built this bike to kill whoever was riding it, and they knew exactly what they were doing." The garage went very quiet. Manny Reyes pushed himself off the wall and headed for the bay door. "Manny," Grip said. One word and Manny stopped. "Stay where you are." Manny stopped. He turned around. His face had gone a color that wasn't good. Grip stood up slowly. He looked at Caleb. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure about what I see," Caleb said. "I'm a mechanic, not a detective. I can show you what I found." "What it means is your department." "Show me again." Caleb showed him again. Every point, every weld. He explained the technique, what it was designed to do, how it would behave under stress, why 5 other shops had missed it, which came down to the fact that the work was done well enough to fool someone, doing a standard inspection, but not well enough to fool someone who was looking at every inch of the frame with a magnifying glass in the specific knowledge of what 1947 knucklehead frame welds were supposed to look like. When he was done, Grip stood up and looked at Manny Reyes for a long time. "I want everyone inside," Grip said quietly. Grip, "Inside. Now. Now." Within 4 minutes, the lot was full again. All 14 of them, plus 3 more, who had apparently been posted on the street that Caleb hadn't seen. They filled the garage and the bay and stood in the late morning heat with their arms at their sides and their faces still, and the silence was the loudest thing Caleb had ever been in the middle of. Grip stood in the center of the garage and looked at Caleb. "Repeat what you told me," he said, to all of them. Caleb felt 17 sets of eyes on him. He was 19 years old. He was standing in a garage his uncle had left him that was $800 a month behind the world, and he was about to tell a room full of Hell's Angels that someone had tried to murder one of their own. He took a breath. The bike was sabotaged, he said. He said it clearly and without softening it the way Raymond had taught him. Facts don't change if you whisper them or shout them. 3 structural points on the frame, the steering head, and both rear rails have been compromised using deliberate professional-grade welding technique designed to mimic repair work. The welds look correct on the surface. They're not. Under highway stress, particularly cornering load or road vibration, the frame would fail. Catastrophically, the rider would have no warning and no chance. He paused. Whoever did this knew motorcycles, knew knuckleheads specifically, knew exactly where to work to make the failure look like age or metal fatigue instead of what it is. No one moved. 5 shops already looked at this bike, Caleb said. I'm not saying they were incompetent. I'm saying they weren't looking for this. They were looking for what breaks. I looked for what was broken on purpose. The man closest to Manny Reyes had quietly positioned himself so that he was between Manny and the door. Caleb noticed this and did not comment on it. The bike can be fixed, Caleb continued, because he needed to stay in his lane, needed to stay the mechanic in the room and let other people be the other things they were in that room. I can cut out the compromised welds and rebuild the frame properly. TIG welding, full structural reconstruction. It'll take time. The 7 hours you gave me, that might be tight. You'll have what you need, Grip said. I need to know the bike is worth fixing, structurally, historically, because if the underlying metal is too fatigued from the sabotage, it's worth fixing, Grip said. This was Iron Jack Crowley's bike. The name meant something to everyone in the room. Caleb could tell by the way the air changed. He didn't know who Iron Jack Crowley was, not yet, but he filed the name away because names that changed air like that were important. Okay, Caleb said, then let me get to work. He turned back to the bike. He heard Grip's voice behind him, low and controlled, beginning to ask Manny Reyes a question that Manny Reyes clearly did not want to answer. He kept his back to it. That wasn't his work. His work was the bike. He pulled the rolling cart of tools to the knucklehead and crouched beside the steering head. His hands were steady. He made sure of that. Then Caleb Ward, 19 years old, breathing debt and heat, in the complicated air of a room full of watching men, picked up his first tool and went to work. Darnell appeared at his side 20 minutes in. You need to know something, Darnell said under his breath. I need to work, Caleb said, not looking up. You need to know this first. A pause. I knew the bike, not personally, but I knew about it. Raymond used to talk about Iron Jack Crowley. There's a reason this bike is important to these men, Caleb, and it's not just history. Caleb kept working. Tell me while I work. Iron Jack was the man who negotiated the peace between 3 different chapters after a split that should have gotten people killed. He's been retired 5 years. The bike's been in storage. Word got out that it was coming back, that Crowley was coming back, and now somebody tried to make sure that didn't happen. Darnell leaned a little closer. That text you got this morning. Caleb stopped. He looked up. What text? He said, because he hadn't gotten a text. Darnell pulled out Caleb's phone, had apparently picked it up off the workbench when Caleb wasn't looking, and held it out. There was a message from a number he didn't recognize received at 9:47 that morning. 3 words. Don't touch the bike. Caleb looked at the message for 5 seconds. Then he handed the phone back to Darnell, turned back to the knucklehead, and picked up his tool again. Okay, he said, okay. Darnell stared at him. That's all you've got. What do you want me to say? The bike still needs fixing. Caleb, somebody warned you off before we even knew, which means somebody knew what was in the bike before we did. Caleb ran the inspection light along the rear rail again, which means this runs deeper than whoever did the welding. He sat back on his heels, and it means they know we're here. They know this bike is here, and it's sitting in my lot. He looked at Darnell. So we're already in it. The only question is, do we do the work or do we walk away? Darnell was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, what would Raymond do? Caleb didn't have to think about it. He'd fix the bike, he said. He went back to work. At 11:23, Manny Reyes walked out of the back of the garage and threw up in the alley. One of the men followed him out and stayed with him. Caleb heard the sound and registered it and kept his focus on the steering head, where he had now confirmed the full extent of the sabotage deeper than he'd initially assessed, more sophisticated, the work of someone who understood metallurgy and failure mechanics at a level that went well beyond a backyard welder. Grip came and stood behind him. "How bad?" "Worse than I thought when I first looked," Caleb said. "Better than it could be. The underlying metal is sound. The sabotage was precise, controlled. Whoever did this wanted it to fail at a specific moment, not immediately. They needed the bike to pass initial visual inspection." "For a ride," Grip said, flat, like a confirmed suspicion. "Like a confirmed—" "Probably, yeah. Some high-speed road event, a rally, a poker run, something where a catastrophic frame failure looks like an accident." Grip said nothing for a moment. "Can you cut it out clean?" "Yes. It'll take 2 hours just for the removal and prep, and I need to be meticulous because I can't leave any compromised material in the joint. Then the TIAG reconstruction. Good TIAG work on a frame this age, getting the thermal properties right, not warping the surrounding metal. That's another 4 hours minimum." "That's 6 hours. Plus test and adjustment." "Yes." Another pause. "What do you need?" "Time." Silence. "And if you have anyone in your network who has a specific knowledge of mid-century Harley frame spec factory tolerances, original weld schedule, I'd rather have that reference available." "Phil Rearin," said a voice from the back of the garage. An older man, 60-something, nobody, Caleb had noticed before, pushed himself forward through the group. He had the look of a man who was very comfortable in rooms that most people would be uncomfortable in. "Phil Rearin," he said again, extending his hand. "Retired law enforcement. Consultant now." He glanced at Grip. "He said we might need documentation before this was over." Caleb shook his hand. "What kind of documentation?" "The kind that protected everyone in this room," Rearin said calmly, "including you. You've made findings that constitute evidence of conspiracy to commit murder. I'm going to need you to walk me through everything you found exactly as you found it, and I'm going to photograph and document it before you start reconstruction." He looked at Caleb with steady, experienced eyes. "You okay with that?" "Yes, sir," Caleb said. Because that was the right answer, and because something about Phil Rearin made him feel for the first time since the convoy had rolled into his lot, like the world had a structure to it that wasn't going to collapse. They spent 40 minutes on documentation. Rearin was thorough without being slow. He asked the right questions. He took photographs from angles Caleb wouldn't have thought to specify. He spoke into a small recorder in a voice that was calm and precise, noting time, location, the identity of each damaged area at Caleb's technical observations and Caleb's credentials. "How long have you been a mechanic?" Rearin asked at one point, not looking up from the camera. "Since I was 11, Caleb said. "My uncle taught me. Any formal certification, ASE Master Technician. Passed the motorcycle certification exam the week after my uncle died." He paused. It seemed like the right thing to do. Rearin looked up from the camera for a moment. Something moved in his eyes that wasn't quite approval and wasn't quite sympathy, but was related to both. "It was," he said, and went back to his work. When the documentation was done, Rearin stepped aside and Caleb Ward picked up his cutting tool and began the most careful and consequential work of his young life. At 12:45, his phone buzzed again. Different number. He didn't check it. He was in the middle of a weld joint, and he did not stop. Darnell checked it for him and read it out quietly. "Walk away from the bike. Last warning." Caleb didn't answer. He didn't stop. The weld he was cutting had been laid by someone who knew what they were doing. He could respect the technical skill even while he was disgusted by the purpose, and it required his complete attention. He removed material in stages, checking the underlying metal after each pass testing temperature, and adjusting his approach. The surrounding frame was sound, good metal well maintained over its life, which told him something about how the bike had been cared for before it came to whoever had done this. Someone had loved this bike for a long time before someone else had decided to make it a weapon. "Caleb," Darnell's voice low and tight. He finished the pass, set down the cutting tool, looked up. At the bay door, standing in the afternoon light, was a man he didn't recognize. Middle-aged, neat, expensive-looking, casual clothes. He was looking at the knucklehead with an expression that was working very hard to be neutral and wasn't quite making it. Grip was already moving toward him. Whatever conversation happened at the bay door happened too quietly for Caleb to hear. He watched it in his peripheral vision as he set up for the next stage of removal. The stranger and Grip talked for 90 seconds. Then the stranger left. Grip came back to the interior of the garage, and the temperature of the room dropped perceptibly. "Keep working," Grip said to Caleb. "I am," Caleb said. "Good." Grip looked at the bike at the evidence of the sabotage, now fully exposed, the bare metal of the damaged welds cut away and the underlying frame showing clean. "You know what you're doing," he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly, it was an acknowledgement. "Yes, sir," Caleb said. "I know what I'm doing." He picked up the next tool and the work continued, and outside in the California afternoon, the perimeter of men held their positions and said nothing. And somewhere at the center of all of it, somewhere between the death trap of a frame and the community of people it had been meant to destroy, a 19-year-old mechanic who had been $800 behind the world that morning kept his hands steady and did the only thing he knew how to do. He fixed what was broken. He told the truth about what he found, and he did not stop. The first compromised weld came out at 1:17 in the afternoon, and when Caleb held the extracted material under the inspection light and looked at what was underneath his stomach, dropped straight through the floor. He had expected bad. He had not expected this precise. The layering was surgical. 3 distinct passes, each one designed to create the illusion of full penetration while leaving a controlled void at the joint root, a void that would remain invisible under any standard inspection, that would hold under static load and low-speed use, and that would propagate into catastrophic fracture the moment the frame hit sustained highway vibration. This wasn't improvised. This wasn't someone who'd learned welding from YouTube and gotten creative. This was someone who had studied failure mechanics, someone who understood not just how to weld, but how welds die. Caleb set the extracted material on a clean rag and didn't say anything for a moment. Phil Rearin was at his shoulder before he found words. "What are you looking at?" "The void," Caleb said. "Look at the root. See how clean that edge is. That's not erosion, that's not fatigue, that's not age. That edge was designed. Whoever did this calculated the geometry of the failure point." Rearin leaned in close. He said nothing for 5 seconds. Then, "So this isn't someone who knows how to damage a bike. This is someone who knows how to engineer a specific type of crash. At a specific speed," Caleb said, "under a specific load condition. Below about 40 miles an hour, this bike would feel wrong, loose soft in the front, which is what your brother reported," he added, looking at Grip. "But it wouldn't go down. Get it above 60 on a curve, any significant lateral force on the frame, and the steering head lets go. The rider never understands what happened." Grip stood completely still. It was the stillness of a man who was feeling something very large and who had spent decades learning to contain very large things. "The bike was supposed to be ridden this weekend," he said. Caleb looked up. "Where Memorial Run, 200 miles, Highway 99 to Bakersfield and back." The pause that had weight to it. Iron Jack was supposed to be on it, first public ride in 5 years. Caleb let that land where it needed to land, then turned back to the work. "I need to pull the second rear rail section," he said. "Darnell, I need the number 3 carbide burr." Darnell was already moving. He put the tool in Caleb's hand without a word, the way they'd worked 100 times, the way you worked with someone when language had stopped being necessary. Behind him, Caleb heard Grip say quietly to no one in particular, "Get me Manny." Time. Manny Reyes came back into the garage looking like a man who had made a decision he didn't know how to live with yet. He was pale under his tonic, and he kept his eyes on the floor, which was how Caleb knew before a single word was exchanged that Manny wasn't just scared. Manny knew something. "Talk to me," Grip said, still quiet, quieter than the situation seemed to require, which was somehow worse than if he'd been loud. "I don't know everything," Manny said. "Tell me what you know." A long pause. Manny's jaw worked. "I heard a name 3 weeks ago, right before the bike came to us. Someone was asking questions about the Memorial Run, about who was going to ride what order, which bike Iron Jack was taking. I heard the name and I didn't..." He stopped. "I didn't think it was what it turned out to be." "What name?" Grip said. Manny looked up for the first time. He looked at Grip, and what was in his face was the particular expression of a man who knows that what he's about to say is going to break something that can't be put back together. "Sutter," he said. Danny Sutter. The name moved through the room like a physical force. Caleb didn't know it, but he felt the room react, and the reaction was specific, not the chaotic heat of anger, but the sudden cold stillness of confirmation. Like everyone in the room had feared something, and Manny had just told them the fear had a name. Reardon was writing, steadily, quietly, his pen moving across his notepad without pause. Sutter's been out of the network for 2 years, said one of the men by the wall, mid-30s, crew-cut, the kind of face that looked like it had been through considerable weather. Since the Modesto meeting. He's been out of what we could see, Grip said. That's different. Caleb kept working. He found the second void at 144. It was larger than the first, not deeper, but wider, spread across more of the joint, and if anything, it was cleaner, more deliberate. Whoever had done the rear rails had been more confident by the second one, had taken more time. He photographed it himself before touching it on Reardon's instruction, and he heard himself describing what he was seeing into Reardon's recorder in a voice that was remarkably steady for a 19-year-old who had eaten half a breakfast burrito 8 hours ago and was currently the only person in a room full of Hell's Angels who was not from that world and had no particular protection in it. "How are you doing?" Darnell said, appearing at his elbow under the pretext of handing him a clean rag. "I'm working," Caleb said. "That's not what I asked." Caleb looked at him briefly. "I'm fine. I need to be fine, so I'm fine. Ask me again in 7 hours." Darnell nodded and stepped back, and Caleb went back to work, and the afternoon moved forward with the particular slow urgency of a situation that is simultaneously running out of time and cannot be rushed. At 2:10, his phone buzzed on the workbench. Not a text this time, a call. Unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. At 2:14, it buzzed again. Same number. At 2:18, the same number called a third time, and Reardon, who had apparently been watching the phone, as much as the bike said, "You should answer that." Caleb wiped his hands, picked up the phone, and answered. "You don't know me," said the voice on the other end. Male 50 or so accent that placed him somewhere in the Central Valley, a voice that was working hard at calm the way people work hard at things they're not naturally good at. "But I know the situation you're in right now." "Who is this?" Caleb said. "Someone who made a mistake and is trying to figure out how to undo it." A pause. "The bike in your shop right now, I need you to stop working on it. You're the second person to tell me that today." A longer pause. "I know. Those weren't my messages. There are people involved in this who are the situation is more complicated than you understand." "Then explain it to me," Caleb said. Reardon had moved close enough to hear. Caleb tilted the phone slightly toward him. Reardon began writing. "I can't do that on the phone," the voice said. "And I can't come to your shop not with a hesitation, not with who's there right now. I need you to understand that what's in that bike is not just about one bike or one ride. There are people who don't want certain things to come out, about the network, about where money has been going, about what Iron Jack Crowley knows that other people would prefer stayed buried." Another pause. "You're a mechanic. You're not supposed to be part of this." "I'm already part of it," Caleb said. "Walk away. I'll make sure you're compensated. The shop's behind on payments, I know that. I can fix that." Something cold and clear settled in Caleb's chest. "You've been watching my shop," he said. Silence. "You knew the bike was coming here," Caleb said. "You knew before it arrived. That's why the text came at 9:47 before they even rolled in." The voice didn't confirm it, didn't deny it. "I'm trying to help you," it said. "I appreciate that," Caleb said. "But I don't change my work based on who's watching. I found what I found. I documented what I documented." "That's already done." He paused. "The bike still needs fixing." He ended the call. The room was very quiet. "Good or a button," Reardon said, still writing. Grip looked at Caleb for a long moment. Then he looked at Phil Reardon. "How much of that did you get?" "Enough," Reardon said. At 2:37, Caleb began the reconstruction. The TAG welder was his uncle's old, heavy, reliable. The way old things are reliable when they've been properly cared for, and Caleb set his parameters, carefully adjusting for the alloy composition of the original frame, calculating the heat input he needed to achieve full fusion without distorting the surrounding metal. This was the part that separated mechanics from artists, Raymond had told him once, though Raymond had immediately walked it back because Raymond hated pretension. "This is the part you can't fake," he'd said instead. "Either you know the metal or you don't." Caleb knew the metal. He ran the first bead on the steering head and felt in the way that welders feel things, the arc tracking properly, the puddle moving right, the fusion happening the way it was supposed to happen. He ran the second bead. Checked temperature. Let it settle. Ran the third. And there. The room around him had taken on a different quality. The men who had been shifting and restless had stilled. A few of them had moved closer, not crowding him, not interrupting, but drawn to the work the way people are sometimes drawn to watching someone do something they're very good at. The arc light flickered and jumped, and Caleb moved with it in a rhythm that was entirely internal and entirely his. Darnell stood off to the side and watched with his arms crossed and his face doing something it didn't often do, which was show everything he was feeling. Phil Rehren documented. He photographed each stage of the reconstruction, noted times, described the process in his recorder with the care of a man building something that was going to need to stand up in a room a lot more formal than a garage in Fresno. Grip sat on a stool near the back wall and watched Caleb. He hadn't moved from that spot in 20 minutes. At 3:15 during a cooling interval, Caleb stood up and rolled his shoulders and found a water bottle that someone had put on the workbench without him asking, which he drank in 3 long pulls. "The name's Sutter," he said, not looking at Grip. "He's the one who had access to the bike before it came to you." "That's what we're working out," Grip said. "The work on the frame, whoever did it, had to have at least 6 hours with the bike, probably more. It's not something you can rush." "I know." "And they needed specific materials. The rod they used for the sabotage welds is a specific alloy I can tell from the melt characteristics. Not a common choice. It would have been sourced." Rehren looked up from his notepad. "You're saying there's a procurement trail." "I'm saying I'm a mechanic, not an investigator. But yes, the material didn't come from a hardware store." Rehren wrote for 30 seconds without stopping. "You ever testify before?" he asked without looking up. "No, sir." "You're going to be very good at it." Caleb drank the rest of the water and picked up the TIG torch and went back to work. At 3:52, the man with the crew cut, whose name turned out to be Briggs, stepped outside to take a call and came back 2 minutes later and said something in Grip's ear that made Grip stand up from the stool for the first time in an hour. "What?" Grip said, not a question. "Sutter's not in Fresno," Briggs said louder now because apparently they were past the point of keeping things quiet. "He's in Bakersfield. He's been there since Tuesday. And he's not alone. There's 3 men with him that nobody in the chapter recognized." "Outside people," Grip said. "Looks that way." "Hired," said one of the other men, a lean, quiet one who'd said nothing all day and now said this one word with the certainty of someone who'd seen the shape of things like this before. "We don't know that," Grip said. "We know enough," the lean man said. Caleb kept welding. He had long since learned that the best thing you could do in a room where a situation was escalating was to keep doing your job. Your job was the thing you controlled. Everything else was what it was. At 4:07, a vehicle pulled in to the lot, not a motorcycle. Caleb heard it from inside, the specific sound of a truck engine cutting off a door opening. Opening footsteps. Different footsteps from the ones he'd been hearing all day. Deliberate, unhurried, the footsteps of a man who had been walking into rooms like this for a long time. He heard the room change before he could see why. It was a physical thing, the way the atmosphere in the garage shifted. Grip straightened. 2 of the men near the door stepped back almost without knowing they were doing it. Even Rehren stopped writing, which Rehren had not done once in 3 hours. Caleb lifted his welding helmet and turned around. The man in the doorway was 62 or 63, built compact and solid with white hair, cut short, in a face that had the quality of landscape that has been through weather and come out on the other side of it harder and cleaner and more itself. He wore a plain black vest worn soft with years. The patches on it were the same as everyone else's, but he wore them differently, the way a flag looks different on the pole of the building it actually stands for. Caleb didn't need to be told who this was. Iron Jack Crowley looked around the room, acknowledged Grip with a single nod, and then looked at the knucklehead, his knucklehead, and at Caleb crouching beside it. He walked over, crouched down, looked at the reconstruction work in progress on the steering, had the new TIG beads laid clean against the old frame metal, the evidence of what had been removed and what was replacing it. "Show me," he said. Caleb showed him. Everything. The extracted sections, the photographs Rehren had taken, the void geometry, the materials, the failure mechanics. He explained it simply and directly, and without softening any of it. Iron Jack Crowley listened without interrupting. When Caleb was done, he was quiet for a long moment. 5 shops, he said finally. Yes, sir. 5 shops looked at this bike and didn't find it. They weren't looking for it, Caleb said. I was looking at everything. Crowley looked at him. Really looked the way Grip had looked when he'd first arrived, but different where Grip's assessment had been calculating. Crowley's was something more like recognition. Like he was seeing something he'd expected to find somewhere eventually. Your uncle was Raymond Ward, Crowley said. Caleb went still. Yes, sir. I knew Raymond 20 years ago before he opened this place. He did work for the chapter back then. A pause. Good man, straight man. Yes, sir. He was. Crowley stood up. He looked at the bike and then at Caleb and then at Grip. How much time left, he said. 2.5 hours, maybe 3, Caleb said. The second rear rail section is the most complex, the damage is wider, and the approach angle is difficult. I can't rush that part. Don't rush it, Crowley said simply. Then he looked at Grip. What do we know about Sutter? And the conversation that followed was not for Caleb, so he turned back to his work because that was where he lived in this situation, and because there was something clarifying about having a very precise and demanding task in front of you when everything around you was complicated and dark. The metal didn't care about any of it. The metal just needed to be right. He positioned himself at the second rear rail and checked his setup, and he heard behind him the voices of men organizing themselves around a problem that was large and real and had a name now. And he understood, not for the first time today, but more clearly now, that what he'd found in this frame was not just sabotage. It was the surface of something that went down much further than he could see. He pressed his helmet down, struck the arc. The work continued. At 4:49, Darnell said, "You need to take a break." "I need to finish the rear rail," Caleb said. "You've been on your knees for 3 hours. You are going to start shaking." Caleb lifted the helmet, looked at his hands. Darnell was right there, was a very slight tremor in the right one, the beginning of fatigue, the kind of thing that didn't matter on most jobs and absolutely mattered on this one. He sat back, let his hands rest flat on his thighs, breathed. "Eat something," Darnell said, and put a sandwich in front of him that had appeared from somewhere. Someone had clearly gone and gotten food at some point, without being asked, which meant someone in this room was paying more attention to Caleb than Caleb had realized. He looked up. The lean, quiet man, the one who had said hired, was leaning against the far wall, looking at the ceiling with great apparent interest. There was an empty paper bag near his boot. Caleb ate the sandwich in 4 minutes, drank more water, let his hands rest until the tremor settled, which took about 6 minutes, and he knew it was settled because he could feel it, the steadiness returning from the wrists outward. He put the helmet back on. At 5:03, Rarin came and crouched beside him. "I need you to do something for me," he said quietly, "when you're done with the reconstruction, before the test ride." "What's that?" "I need you to write a technical summary, in your own words, your own language, what you found, where you found it, what it means, your assessment of the skill level required to produce this damage, your assessment of the time required, your assessment of the material used." He looked at Caleb steadily. "I need it in writing in your name, with your certification credentials." "Can you do that?" "Yes, sir. I know that's extra work on top of an already long day." "It's the right thing to do," Caleb said. Rarin nodded. "It is," he said, "and I want you to know what you're doing here is more significant than fixing a motorcycle. You understand that?" "I understand it's complicated," Caleb said. "I'm choosing not to think too hard about exactly how complicated while I'm still in the middle of the weld." Rarin almost smiled. "Smart," he said, and stood up and went back to his notepad. At 5:44, Caleb Ward finished the second rear rail reconstruction, set down the TIG torch, and sat back on his heels. He ran the inspection light over both repaired sections with the deliberate patience of a man who is not going to declare something done until he is completely certain it is done. He examined every bead, checked penetration at the margins, looked for any sign of distortion in the surrounding frame metal. Clean, solid, better than the original spec if he was honest, because the original spec was 70-some years old and his knowledge of metallurgy and joint design was current. He stood up. "Both sections are done," he said. I need 30 minutes of cool time before I can do the final inspection and load test. Then we'll talk about the test ride. The room was looking at him. All of it, Grip, Crowley, Rear, and Darnell. 17 men whose names he didn't know, all of them looking at a 19-year-old in a welding helmet, standing over a bike that had been built to kill one of the most significant men in the room. Iron Jack Crowley looked at the steering head and the rear rails and the clean, confident reconstruction work and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "This kid didn't just fix it. He exposed what we missed." He wasn't talking to Caleb. He was talking to Grip. But every person in the room heard it and the weight of it, and Caleb heard it too. And he felt it somewhere deeper than his chest, somewhere that had Raymond Ward's voice in it, the steady, certain voice of a man who had taught him that the work was always worth doing right. He set the helmet on the workbench. He asked Darnell for the inspection checklist. He had 30 minutes of cool time, and he was going to use every one of them. Because the bike wasn't done yet, and neither was the day. The 30 minutes of cool time felt like 30 minutes inside a hell breath. Caleb sat on his rolling stool and drank water and kept his hands in his lap and did not look at anyone, because if he looked at anyone, he would have to process what was in their faces, and what was in their faces was something he wasn't ready to process yet. He was still in the mechanical part of his brain, the part that dealt in tolerances and temperatures and material properties, and he needed to stay there a little longer, because the other part, the part that understood what had almost happened to the man sitting 10 feet away from him, was going to be loud when he let it speak, and he couldn't afford loud right now. Iron Jack Crowley sat against the back wall and said almost nothing. He answered questions from Grip in short sentences. He looked at his phone twice and put it away both times. Mostly he looked at the bike with the expression of a man who is recalibrating something fundamental about the world he thought he understood. Darnell stayed close to Caleb without making a production of it. That was Darnell's particular skill, presence without pressure, proximity without intrusion. He'd done it for Raymond in the bad years after Raymond's wife left, and he was doing it now for Caleb. And Caleb was grateful in the wordless way you're grateful for things that are exactly right. At the 18-minute mark, Raren took a call outside. He came back in with his face arranged into the particular blankness of a man who has just received significant information and is deciding what to share and with whom and in what order. He went to Grip first, 2 minutes of quiet conversation. Then Grip went to Crowley. Then all three of them looked at Caleb. "What?" Caleb said. Raren walked over. "The number that called you this afternoon, we traced it." Caleb waited. "It's registered to a holding company in Stockton. The holding company has 4 directors on paper. 3 of them are names we recognize from legitimate business dealerships, a real estate partnership. Nothing unusual. The 4th director." Raren paused. "The 4th director is a man named Victor Keel. He runs mechanical services for 3 motorcycle dealerships in the valley. High-end restoration work, custom builds." Another pause. "He's also the man who certified the Knucklehead's last restoration 8 months ago, before it went into storage." The garage went completely still. "He certified it," Caleb said slowly, "signed off on a full structural inspection. Frame integrity well condition, safety rating. All clear." Caleb looked at the extracted sabotage material on the clean rag, at the void geometries, at the work that was too precise and too calculated to be anything but deliberate. "He certified it after the sabotage," he said. "He signed off on a bike he knew was going to kill someone." "That's what the documentation is going to argue," Raren said. "Yes." "So Keel did the welding," said Grip. "Or supervised it," Raren said. "We can't know that yet, but he had the access and the knowledge, and he tried to stop the bike from being fixed today." He looked at Caleb. "He called you. He offered you money. He told you to walk away." Caleb sat with that for a moment. The voice on the phone, calm, working at calm, the voice of a man who was not naturally calm, reorganized itself in his memory around this new information and became something different. Not a warning, a confession wearing a warning's clothes. "He said the situation was more complicated than I understood," Caleb said. He was right about that part. "He also said there were things Iron Jack Crowley knew that certain people wanted to stay buried," Raren said. He looked at Crowley. "I think that's a conversation for you." Crowley stood up from the wall. He was not a large man, not the way Grip was large, but the quality of his stillness made space around him the way large men's size did. 3 years ago, he said, addressing the room rather than any one person, There was a vote in the broader network about a business arrangement, an investment, moving money through certain channels associated with a land development operation in Kern County. I voted against it. I was the deciding vote. He paused. The arrangement went away. A significant amount of planned profit went away with it. There were people who blamed me for that. He looked at Grip. I assumed it was settled. I was wrong. Sutter was involved in that investment, Briggs said from the side of the room. Statement, not question. Sutter introduced it, Crowley said. The room processed this in silence. Caleb processed it too, fitting the pieces into the shape they made Sutter proposing the deal, Crowley killing it 3 years of quiet resentment, building into something that looked like a solution. The solution wearing the shape of a carefully sabotaged motorcycle on a memorial run on a California highway. So this isn't just about Crowley, Caleb said. He hadn't planned to speak. The words came out because the logic demanded them. If Crowley dies in a crash on the memorial run, that's one problem solved. But the investigation into the crash into the bike, that's a risk. Unless the investigation goes nowhere because 5 shops have already said the frame was compromised by age and stress. The narrative was already built. He stopped. They built the narrative first. 5 shops all saying the same thing or establishing that the bike was too far gone to save. Then the crash happens and it looks like a tragedy, not a murder because everyone already knew the bike was dangerous and it just finally gave out. The room looked at him. I'm just a mechanic, he said, but that's what the evidence describes. Reardon was writing so fast his hand was a blur. Say that again, he said. Slower. Caleb said it again slower into the recorder, and Reardon got every word. At 6:09, Caleb finished the cool period inspection and declared the reconstruction sound. He said it without fanfare, just stood up from his examination, made a note in the job log and said, frame is solid, ready for full inspection and alignment check before the test ride. But something moved in the room when he said it, a release of tension that had been holding since the afternoon, and several of the men who'd been standing for hours shifted and breathed and looked at each other. Darnell clapped once quietly into his own palm. Just once. It was enough. Grip walked over and looked at the repaired sections. He didn't touch anything he knew better than to touch work that hadn't been cleared, but he looked for a long time and Caleb could see him understanding what he was looking at. The quality of the reconstruction, the precision of it. Full alignment check, Grip said. What does that take? 40 minutes if everything's where it should be. I'll check rake and trail measure steering geometry against factory spec for a 47 knucklehead. I have the reference in Raymond's manual library. He kept every factory document he could get his hands on and do a full check of every connection point. He paused. I'll also need to do a final inspection of the drivetrain. We've been focused on the frame, but if someone was thorough enough to do what they did to the steering head and rear rails, I want to make sure they didn't touch anything else. Do it, Iron Jack said from across the room. Caleb did it. The alignment was close to factory spec in most dimensions and required minor adjustment in 2. He made the adjustments with the deliberate patience that had characterized his entire day. Not rushing, not cutting corners. He checked the drivetrain. Primary drive transmission, final chain. All correct, no evidence of tampering. He checked the engine mounts, the carburetor settings, the electrical connections. At 6:51, he straightened up and said, the bike is ready for a test ride. And then Manny Reyes, who had been sitting in the far corner of the garage since his conversation with Grip hours earlier and had said almost nothing since, stood up and said, there's something else. Every head in the room turned. Manny looked at Grip. His face had moved through several stages of bad over the course of the day and had arrived somewhere past fear into the territory of exhausted resignation that men reach when they have decided the truth is less heavy than the secret. The certification, he said, Keel's sign-off on the frame inspection 8 months ago. I knew it was wrong. He stopped, breathed. I saw the bike before it went to Keel. I saw what was in the frame. I didn't, he stopped it again. I convinced myself I was wrong, that I'd misread it, that someone with Keel's reputation wouldn't. He looked at the floor. I was scared, and I talked myself into not being sure because not being sure meant I didn't have to do anything. The room was very quiet. I'm sure now, Manny said. Grip looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Reardon. He'll need to make a statement, Reardon said. I know, Manny said. I'll make one. Iron Jack Crowley walked to the bike. He stood beside the knucklehead and looked at it the way a man looks at something that is both exactly what it was and completely changed. Same lines, same engine, same decades of history in the metal. But everything underneath it now was different. What had been a death sentence was a machine again. What had been a lie was the truth. He put his hand on the tank, just rested it there. My father bought this bike the year the war ended, he said. Nobody had asked him to explain. He explained anyway the way people sometimes do when the day has reached a certain depth. He rode it for 30 years, gave it to me when he couldn't ride anymore. I put another 40 years on it. He paused. There's not a road in California I haven't ridden this thing on. Nobody spoke. Whoever decided this was the way to end things, he said, made a choice about what this bike means, what it represents. He took his hand off the tank. They were wrong about that. And they were wrong about what I know and what I'm willing to say. He looked at Riran. I'm going to want to give you a full statement about the investment, about the vote, about every conversation I've had with anyone connected to this in the last 3 years. All of it. I'll take it, Riran said. Tonight. Tonight, Riran agreed. Crowley looked at Caleb. First, he said, the boy rides the bike. Caleb blinked. Sir, test rider. You built it. You ride it first. Caleb looked at the knucklehead, then at Grip. Grip's expression said this was not a suggestion. I've ridden older bikes, Caleb said, but I want you to know I'll keep it under 60 controlled environment just long enough to confirm the frame behavior under load. I know what a test ride is, Crowley said. There was something almost warm in it. Caleb wheeled the knucklehead out of the bay and into the lot, and for the first time in hours he was outside, and the evening was cooler than the day had been, and the light was going amber and flat, the way Central Valley light went in the early evening, and around the perimeter of the lot, the men who had been there all day, and the few who had arrived during the afternoon stood and watched him. He kick-started the knucklehead on the second kick. The engine fired and settled into the particular sound of a knucklehead running. Right, a sound that Caleb had heard on recordings and in his uncle's descriptions, but had never actually been beside in person. And it was different from recordings. It was more alive, more individual. The sound of a specific machine with a specific history doing what it was built to do. He sat for 30 seconds and listened, felt the vibration through the frame, read what the bike was telling him through his hands, in his seat and his feet on the pegs. Nothing wrong, nothing loose, nothing pulling or shaking or hesitating. He rode it around the block, took it up to 50 on the straightaway, steady planted the steering, tracking clean and true, the frame absorbing load the way a properly built frame absorbed it, which was to say completely and without drama. He took a corner at 40, feeling for any flex or reluctance in the front end. Nothing. Perfect. He brought it back into the lot and cut the engine and sat there for a moment in the settling quiet. Well, Grip said. It's right, Caleb said. It's better than right. The reconstruction on the steering head improved the geometry slightly. The original spec was a compromise that made sense in 1947, and we can do better now. The bike is solid. It's safe. He paused. It's ready. Iron Jack Crowley walked forward and put his hand on the knucklehead again, and this time he didn't take it off. Caleb climbed off and stepped back, and in stepping back, realized his legs were not entirely steady, which was fine because he'd been crouching and standing and crouching again for almost 9 hours on a concrete floor. Grip handed him an envelope. That's for the work, he said. Caleb looked at the envelope. He could feel the thickness of it. He didn't open it, not there, but he knew it was more than any job he'd ever quoted for this garage, probably more than any 3 jobs combined. I priced it as a standard frame restoration, he said. I know what you priced it as, Grip said. This isn't the quote price. Caleb looked at him. That's not charity, Grip said. That's accurate. Caleb put the envelope in his pocket. There's something else, Grip said. His voice had shifted slightly, moved from the flat functional register he'd used all day into something that was not quite personal, but was adjacent to it. Riran is going to need your technical summary tonight. Written, credentialed, the whole thing. Are you going to be able to do that? Yes, sir. And you understand what that document is going to become. Evidence, Caleb said. Evidence in a criminal case. Conspiracy to commit murder. Possibly more depending on what Crowley's statement opens up and what we find when we start pulling on the other threads. Grip looked at him steadily. Your name is going to be on a document that puts Victor Keel and Danny Sutter in front of a prosecutor. You're 19 years old. I want you to understand what that is before you sign it." Caleb thought about the voice on the phone, the calm voice working at Calm, the offer of money, the knowledge that his shop was in debt, the calculation behind it, the assessment that Caleb Ward could be bought, that a struggling 19-year-old with a failing garage was a manageable problem. "I don't change facts to protect anyone," Caleb said. He said it simply without drama, the way his uncle had said the things Raymond believed, because Raymond had always held that the truth was strongest when you didn't shout it. Grip held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he nodded once, and the nod said several things that he didn't put into words, and Caleb received all of them. Rearan sat up at the workbench with his recorder and his notepad and a laptop he'd produced from a bag in his truck. Caleb washed his hands and face at the shop sink. The water ran gray and then brown, and then finally clear. 11 hours of work coming off his skin, and came back and sat across from Rearan and began. He started at the beginning, the convoy arriving, the first look at the bike, the 18 minutes before he touched the steering head, what he felt when he touched it, what he saw under the inspection light. He went through every technical finding in sequence, using correct terminology, giving measurements where he had them, describing his methodology, citing the reference materials he'd used for factory spec comparison. Rearan typed as he talked. Occasionally he asked a question to clarify something, to tighten a description, to nail down a specific measurement. He was a precise listener, the kind that made you more precise by the quality of his attention. At the back of the garage, Briggs took a call and walked outside fast and came back and went directly to Grip, and whatever he said made Grip stand up and move to the bay door and look out into the lot. Caleb kept talking. He was inside the technical record now, and he didn't want to break the flow. At 7:43, he finished the summary, and Rearan read it back to him in full. It was accurate, every word. "Sign it," Rearan said, and slid a printed copy across the workbench. Caleb signed it. He put his ASE certification number below his name. He put the date, he put the address of the shop, he slid it back. And then Grip appeared at the workbench with something in his face that Caleb had not seen there all day. Something that was not calm and was not calculated, and said, "Keel is in Bakersfield with Sutter, and there are more of them than we knew." A pause. This wasn't just about Crowley. There are 3 other names on a list that Keel kept, 3 other men in the network who voted the same way Crowley voted 3 years ago. He looked at Caleb steadily. The memorial run wasn't the only plan. It was the first. The room was completely still. They were going to take down 4 men, Grip said. Crowley was first because he was the most visible, the most symbolic. Iron Jack Crowley sat with this information the way he seemed to sit with all information, absorbing it without visible collapse, processing it somewhere deep, his face doing almost nothing. "How sure are we?" he said. "Sure enough," said Briggs. Manny confirmed 2 of the other names, and there's a document. Keel kept records, apparently. The kind of records a man keeps when he needs insurance against the people he's working with. "Where is the document?" Rearan said, snapping to full alert. "Being photographed right now. One of our people has access to Keel's storage unit in Modesto. We're getting it in the next 30 minutes. Caleb sat at the workbench and looked at his signed statement and understood that the day had opened a door that he'd walked through without fully seeing it, and the room on the other side of that door was larger and darker and more consequential than anything his 19 years had previously contained. Darnell sat down next to him, put his forearms on the workbench, said nothing. "You okay?" Caleb said. "I'm old enough to know when a day is going to become a story," Darnell said. "This is one of those days." Caleb looked at the knucklehead sitting in the middle of the lot, visible through the bay door, the evening light catching the chroma bike that had been built to kill a man and was now whole again. "Yeah," he said, "it is." His phone buzzed. He looked at it without hope or dread because the day had long since burned through his capacity for either. Unknown number. Text message. 3 words again, the same 3 words as this morning, except these 3 words were different. "Thank you, son." He stared at it for a moment. Then he showed it to Darnell. Darnell read it, looked up, looked around the room. Neither of them could identify who had sent it. Nobody in the room appeared to be on a phone. Maybe it was Keel again trying a different angle. Maybe it was someone they hadn't identified yet. Maybe it was something else entirely. Caleb put the phone in his pocket. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. And Caleb Ward 9 hours into the longest day of his life, with grease under his fingernails and a signed statement in Reren's hands and a rebuilt motorcycle running solid in the lot, was not done yet. The document from Keel's storage unit in Modesto arrived at 8:11 in the evening, and it arrived the way bad news always arrives, quietly through a phone screen, in the form of photographs that took 30 seconds to look at and a long time to understand. Briggs stood at the center of the garage and scrolled through the images on his phone with Grip at his shoulder and Reren at his other shoulder, and the three of them looked at what Victor Keel had kept apparently for years, apparently as insurance against the very people he was working with, which told Caleb something about the world these men operated in, that even inside a conspiracy, nobody fully trusted anybody, and smart conspirators kept records of the people who could destroy them. "How many pages?" Reren said. 43 photographs, Briggs said. "Not all of them are clear, but enough. I need copies. Right now." Briggs airdropped them without hesitation, and Reren's phone buzzed 43 times in sequence, while Reren was already putting on reading glasses and pulling up the first image. Caleb sat at the workbench and watched this happen and understood that the thing he had started by crouching over a steering head with a magnifying glass, that morning had grown into something that was now entirely outside his hands, which was both a relief and a strange kind of loss. The way it feels when you hand off a patient you have been working on and suddenly your job is just to wait. "Names," Reren said, not looking up from his phone. "I need you to tell me every name in those documents." Briggs listed them. 6 names. Keel and Sutter they knew. The other 4 were new, and each new name landed in the room with its own specific weight, some lighter, some heavier. And when the 5th name came out, a man named Terrence Voss, who ran a legitimate insurance brokerage in Fresno, Iron Jack Crowley, made a sound that was not quite a word and looked at the wall for a moment. "Jack," Grip said. "Voss handled the original investment paperwork," Creeley said. "When I voted against the deal, he was in the room. He shook my hand afterward." A pause. "He told me he respected the decision." Nobody said anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. "I want to be very clear about something," Reren said, still reading, his voice precise and steady. "What I have in these photographs, assuming they're authentic and will need forensic verification, is evidence of a coordinated conspiracy to murder multiple individuals within this network. That is a federal matter. That goes beyond anything I can handle alone, or that this organization should handle alone." He looked up. He looked at Crowley first, then Grip. "I need to make calls tonight. I have contacts in the FBI field office in Sacramento who I trust personally. This needs to be in their hands by morning." The room held its collective breath. This was the moment Caleb had understood was coming since about 2 in the afternoon. The moment when the thing that had started as a mechanical problem finished its transformation into something that required people with badges and jurisdiction and the full weight of the federal government. He'd understood it was coming, and he'd kept working anyway because his job was the bike, and now the bike was done, and the thing that came after the bike was Reren's job and Crowley's, and ultimately the law's. But he watched Grip's face while Reren talked, and what was in Grip's face was not simple. It was the face of a man who had spent decades operating in a world where you handled your own problems, where you did not bring in outside authority, where the structure of the organization was the structure of justice for things that happened inside it. What Reren was proposing violated every instinct that had kept Grip alive and functional for 25 years in this world. "I know what I'm asking," Reren said quietly, looking directly at Grip. "I know exactly what I'm asking." Grip looked at Iron Jack. Crowley said, "Do it." 1 second, 1 word, and the room exhaled. "I'll need the garage for another 2 hours," Reren said, already dialing. "Caleb, I need you to stay. I may have additional questions while I'm on the call." "I'm not going anywhere," Caleb said. The call lasted 47 minutes. Reren paced the length of the garage in a slow oval while he talked, and Caleb could hear the shape of the conversation without hearing the words. The methodical construction of a case, the careful presentation of evidence, the names given in sequence, the ask at the end that was really a statement of what needed to happen. Reren was good at this. He'd clearly done it before, or something enough like it that the form was natural to him. While Reren paced the garage reorganized itself, Manny Reyes sat with Briggs and gave a full verbal account of everything he'd seen and heard over the past 3 weeks, Briggs taking notes on his phone with a focus that Caleb found quietly impressive. The lean, quiet man whose name Caleb had finally learned was Garrett stood at the bay door and watched the lot with the unhurried attention of someone whose job was specifically to watch for things that shouldn't be there. Two other men went outside and repositioned without being asked, because this was a group that communicated in adjustments and body language more than words, and everyone in it understood what the new information meant for how the night needed to be managed. Darnell made coffee. He'd found Raymond's old percolator in the back room. Caleb had forgotten it was there, and he filled it and plugged it in, and the smell of it moved through the garage and changed the texture of the air in a small but real way, made it slightly more human. Iron Jack Crowley came and sat across from Caleb at the workbench. They hadn't spoken directly since the test ride. Crowley had been in motion, taking calls, talking to Grip, processing the cascade of information that had come in over the last 2 hours. And Caleb had been in the mechanic's particular form of stillness that comes after a long job, the quiet of a body that has been fully extended and is now existing in the absence of the work. "Tell me about Raymond," Crowley said. It was the last thing Caleb expected him to say. And maybe that was the point. "He taught me everything I know," Caleb said. "He was the kind of mechanic who treated every game like it mattered, even the ones that didn't. He said you couldn't turn it on and off. Either you had standards or you didn't, and the difference always showed eventually." Crowley nodded slowly. "That sounds like the man I knew." "You worked with him?" "Briefly. Years ago, before the chapter moved south. He did transmission work on 3 of our bikes one winter. Charged us fair, did it right, didn't make a thing of who we were." He paused. "That's rarer than people think." Caleb looked at the knucklehead in the lot. "He would have found the sabotage," he said. "He would have found it the same way I did, because he taught me how to look at everything, not just the obvious." "But he's not here," Crowley said, gently, no edge in it. "No, sir, he's not." "And you kept the shop going?" "Trying to." "Today was not trying," Crowley said. "Today was doing." Caleb didn't have an answer for that, so he didn't manufacture one. He let it sit there between them, which felt right. Darnell put 2 cups of coffee on the workbench. Crowley picked one up. Caleb picked up the other. For a minute, they just sat there, 2 people from entirely different worlds, connected by a dead man's teaching and a 70-year-old motorcycle that was now, against all reasonable expectation, whole. Reardon ended his call at 9:03 and came back to the workbench with his phone in his hand and his face organized into the particular expression of a man who has accomplished something significant and is already thinking about what comes next. "FBI field office in Sacramento," he said. "Special Agent Diane Cho. She's been working organized crime in the Valley for 6 years. She knew some of these names already." He set his phone down. "They'll be moving on Keel and Sutter tonight. Not this minute, but before morning. They need a few hours to coordinate with the Bakersfield field office and establish that Sutter is still there." "He's still there," Garrett said from the door without turning around. "Confirmed 20 minutes ago." Reardon looked at Garrett with the expression of a man who has chosen not to ask how that was confirmed. "Voss and the others will be picked up simultaneously," Reardon continued. "Cho doesn't want anyone tipped off by a partial action." He looked at Crowley. "Your statement, everything you're going to tell me tonight about the investment, the vote, the subsequent context becomes part of a federal case. That means testimony. It means your name on a public record." "I know what it means," Crowley said. "The other 3 men on the list, the other targets, they need to be warned tonight." "Already done," Grip said. 30 minutes ago." Reardon nodded. "Okay." He looked at Caleb. "Your technical summary becomes exhibit evidence. Your name goes on it in a federal case file. You understand that?" "You asked me this afternoon," Caleb said. "The answer's the same." Reardon almost smiled again. He'd almost smiled several times today and never quite gotten there, which Caleb suspected was simply how the man was built. "Agent Cho would like to speak with you directly. Tonight, if possible, by phone. She has technical questions about the frame damage that she'd like answered by you rather than interpreted from the summary." "I'll talk to her," Caleb said. "She may want you available for the early stages of the investigation. Physical evidence examination, chain of custody documentation, potentially a meeting with her forensic engineering contact who will need to verify your reconstruction. I'll be available." "Good." Reardon picked up his coffee, looked at it, drank it. "This has been," he said, "an extraordinary day." "Yes, sir," Darnell said from the back of the room. "It genuinely has." "What?" At 9:27, Caleb's phone rang, and the screen said FBI Agent Cho which was not a thing he'd expected to see on his phone at any point in his life, and he answered it in the bay doorway with the night air coming in cool from the lot. Agent Cho was efficient and specific and had clearly read the summary Riran had transmitted because she didn't ask him to repeat what was in it. She asked him 4 technical questions about the sabotage welds, the specific alloy characteristics, the estimated heat input from the bead profile, the time window for the work based on the number of passes and the cooling intervals required between them, and Caleb answered all 4 clearly and with the precision that had characterized everything he'd said about the technical findings all day. Conservative estimate on the time required to produce all 3 sabotage points, she said. 8 hours minimum, Caleb said. For someone working at that skill level who understood the failure mechanics and was taking care not to leave obvious evidence. Probably closer to 10. It's not work you rush. And the skill level, could this be self-taught? Or are we looking at formal training? Formal training. This is someone who had professional instruction in structural welding, possibly with specific coursework in failure analysis or materials engineering. The void geometry isn't something you figure out on your own. You learn that. A pause on the line. Thank you. That's consistent with what we know about Keel's background. Another pause. Mr. Ward, this is good work. What you did today. I fixed the bike, Caleb said. You did more than that, she said, and ended the call. He stood in the bay door for a moment. The lot was quieter than it had been all day. Most of the men had repositioned or were in vehicles at the perimeter, the visible presence reduced to 3 or 4, the rest distributed in ways that Garrett apparently understood, and Caleb didn't need to. The knucklehead sat in the lot with the evening light on it, patient and solid. He went back inside. At 9:50, something happened that he didn't expect. Grip came and stood in front of him, and the big man's face had changed from what it had been all day, the flat, calibrated, watchful expression that was Grip's professional face, into something more actual. I want to tell you something, Grip said, and I want you to hear it as what it is, which is not a compliment. Compliments are cheap. Caleb waited. When we brought that bike here this morning, my expectation was that you'd look at it for an hour and tell me the same thing 5 other shops told me. Maybe you'd find something they missed, maybe you wouldn't, but I expected you'd know your limits and say so. He paused. I was not expecting what happened instead. I was just doing the job, Caleb said. That's the thing, Grip said. The job you were doing and the job everybody else did were technically the same job. Look at the bike, assess the frame, tell us what you find. The difference was how you did it. You didn't go looking for what was wrong, you went looking for everything, and what was wrong happened to be in there. He looked at Caleb steadily. Raymond taught you that? Yes, sir. Raymond was a good man who built a good mechanic. He paused. This shop should not close. Caleb said nothing. I'm not talking about the envelope, Grip said. That's payment for work. I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about whether this garage exists in 6 months. He looked around at the space, the equipment that had been Raymond's before it was Caleb's, the calendar on the wall, the smell of oil and metal that had soaked into the concrete over decades. The network needs trusted shops, places where work is done right and nobody talks about what they see. Raymond was one of those places. He paused. You want to be one of those places that's a conversation we can have. Caleb took that in carefully. He understood what was being offered and what it meant and how it could go wrong. He also understood that this was not a moment for a quick answer. I appreciate that, he said. Let me think about how I want to run this shop before I agree to anything. Grip looked at him, then he nodded, and what was in the nod said correct answer. At 10:15, Manny Reyes came to Caleb. He came the way people come when they've been carrying something heavy for a long time and have finally decided to set it down slowly with the careful movements of someone who isn't entirely sure their legs are going to cooperate. I should have said something 3 weeks ago, he said, when I saw the bike before it went to Keel. Yeah, Caleb said, because that was true in saying it wasn't going to help either of them. I convinced myself I wasn't sure, that I might be wrong, that Keel would see it anyway. He stopped. I've been a mechanic for 22 years. I knew what I saw. Caleb looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Because you're 19 years old and you didn't hesitate, Manny said. You found it in 18 minutes and you didn't hesitate. And I need to understand how that happens, how a person is built like that. Caleb thought about it honestly. I don't know if it's how I'm built, he said. I think it's what I was taught. My uncle never once said I'm not sure when he was sure. He said it when he wasn't sure. But when he knew something, he said it. Every time. He looked at the bike. I guess I just assumed that was how it was supposed to work. Manny was quiet for a long time. I'm going to give this statement, he said. Everything. All of it. I know, Caleb said. Rearin told me. I wanted to tell you myself. He paused. You didn't have any reason to do what you did today. You could have looked at that bike for 20 minutes and said the same thing 5 other shops said. You'd have gotten paid something and they would have left and none of this. I couldn't have done that, Caleb said simply. Manny looked at him. I mean it literally, Caleb said. I can't look at something and not see what I see. I don't know how to do that. He paused. My uncle tried to quit drinking once, said it was the hardest thing he ever did because every time he tried to not see a bottle, he saw it more clearly. I think it's like that. The more you try to not know something, you know the more you know it. He shrugged. So I just say it. Manny nodded slowly. He extended his hand. Caleb shook it. Take care of this shop, Manny said. It's worth taking care of. At 10:44, Briggs came back inside fast. Keel's in custody, he said. Bakersfield P.D. picked up Sutter and the 3 men with you in 20 minutes ago. Voss was taken in Sacramento at 10:30. He was reading from his phone from a text chain that was apparently updating in real time. All 6, simultaneous. The room absorbed this. Iron Jack Crowley closed his eyes for 3 seconds. Just 3. Then he opened them. What about the memorial run, he said, this weekend? Up to you, Grip said. Son. Everything's secured, the threat's neutralized. Crowley looked at the knucklehead in the lot. At the rebuilt frame, the clean reconstruction, the machine that was better now than it had been before someone had decided to make it a weapon. The run happens, he said, as scheduled. Grip nodded. Then we've got work to do. And he turned and began talking to Briggs and Garrett and 2 others. The logistics of the weekend now replacing the logistics of the crisis. The organization pivoting from emergency to function with a smoothness that told Caleb everything about how these men had survived this long. Caleb sat at the workbench and looked at his hands. They were clean now, scrubbed twice at the shop sink, but the knuckles had that particular redness that came from a day of real work, and there was a small burn on the inside of his right wrist from a moment during the TIG reconstruction when his concentration had slipped just slightly and the arc had kissed him before he corrected. He hadn't mentioned it. It wasn't bad enough to mention. Darnell appeared and put a hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder. You should eat something real, he said. Not a half a burrito and a sandwich. Real food. I know, Caleb said. I'm going to go get food. You want anything specific? Whatever you get is fine. That's what you always say. It's always true. Darnell left, and for a moment in the middle of a garage that had held 17 bikers and a retired detective and 2 federal investigations and 11 hours of mechanical work, Caleb Ward sat alone with a cup of cold coffee and the faint smell of TIG welding still in the air and the sound of the night outside and let himself feel the full weight of the day for the first time. It was enormous. He'd known it was coming. You couldn't outwork that kind of weight forever, and he hadn't tried to. He'd just put it off until the job was done, but knowing it was coming didn't make it smaller when it arrived. His hands were shaking slightly now, the same fine tremor that had started at 4:49 and had never fully gone away, just been controlled. He breathed. He looked at the calendar on the wall, the 1987 promotional calendar that had no business still being there and was still there anyway. Raymond Ward's handwriting on several of the dates in a pen that had run dry years ago. Notes to himself, reminders, appointments. One of the dates had a star drawn next to it, small and neat, the kind of star you draw when something matters. Caleb looked at it and didn't know what it meant and was okay with not knowing because some of what Raymond had been would always be past explaining. And that was fine. That was how it was supposed to be. He turned back to the lot. The knucklehead was still there. Solid, whole, ready. And somewhere out in the California night, something that had been set in motion against good men was now stopped, and the men it had been set against were alive, and the weekend run would happen, and a 1947 Harley knucklehead that had been built to kill would instead carry its rightful rider down the highway one more time. Caleb Ward had fixed the bike. He had told the truth about what he found. He had not stopped. And now, without his quite noticing, when it had shifted, the day was no longer a crisis. It was something else. Something that didn't have a clean name yet, but felt in the bones, in the hands, in the specific tiredness of someone who has done everything they could and found it was enough, like the beginning of something. The lot was quiet, the night was cool, and from somewhere down the block came the distant rumble of an engine. Just one bike, just someone heading home, and the sound of it in the dark was exactly right. Darnell came back with food at 11:22, paper bags from the Mexican place 3 blocks over that stayed open late, the kind of place where the food was real and nobody asked questions, and he set them on the workbench and looked at Caleb and said, "Eat first, everything else after." Caleb ate. Carne asada, rice, black beans, a stack of tortillas that were still warm, and he ate all of it without tasting much of it because his body had crossed the line from hunger into the territory. Past hunger, where you eat for function, and not pleasure, where the food is fuel, and your body knows it and processes it with the urgency of a machine that has been running on empty for too long. Darnell ate beside him without talking, which was exactly right. Grip was on the phone in the far corner of the garage, moving between calls, his voice low and steady and continuous, the way a man's voice gets when he is coordinating something that has many moving parts. Garrett was still at the bay door. Iron Jack Crowley was with Rarin at the other end of the workbench, going through the statement Rarin would formalize in the morning. Crowley's voice quiet and precise as he laid out 3 years of history with the care of a man who understands that what he says now has to be exactly true and exactly complete. At 11:42, Rarin looked up from his notepad and said, "Caleb, one more thing." Caleb looked up from his food. "Agent Cho called while you were eating. The forensic team that's going to examine the extracted sabotage material, they want to do it here, in this shop. Day after tomorrow, assuming you're available." He paused. "They want you present for the examination, walking them through what you found in the sequence you found it." "Here," Caleb said, "your equipment, your space, your documentation. Chain of custody is cleaner this way." He looked at Caleb steadily. "This shop becomes the examination site for federal physical evidence. I want you to understand what that is." Caleb looked at the garage, at Raymond's equipment and Raymond's calendar, and the smell of the place that had been soaking into him since he was 11 years old. And his uncle had first put a wrench in his hand and said, "Feel what it's doing. Don't just look at it, feel it." The garage that was $800 behind the world that morning and was now. He hadn't opened the envelope yet, but he could feel its weight in his back pocket, something different. "Yes," he said. "This shop. Day after tomorrow." Rarin nodded and went back to Crowley. Darnell picked up the food bags and folded them neatly and put them in the trash and came back and sat down, and he said very quietly, so that only Caleb could hear, "Raymond would not believe this day." "No," Caleb said. "He wouldn't. He would be—" Darnell stopped. His jaw worked briefly. "He would be very proud. I need you to know that. Because I knew that man for 20 years, and I know exactly what he would say right now. And it would not be complicated. It would be simple. He would say, 'You did right. Start to finish it all day long. You did right.'" Caleb looked at the workbench, at his hands on it. "Thank you, Darnell." "Don't thank me. Just keep doing it." So, at 12:07 in the morning, 13 hours after the convoy had first rolled into the lot, Iron Jack Crowley finished his preliminary statement to Rarin, capped his coffee cup, and stood up. He walked to the bay door and looked out at the lot and at the knucklehead sitting in it, and he stood there for a long moment without saying anything. Then he turned around and looked at Caleb. "I've made a decision," he said. The room, which had been at a low operational hum, went quiet in the specific way it went quiet when Crowley spoke with that particular register. Grip stopped his phone call. Garrett turned from the door. Briggs looked up. "This shop," Crowley said, "is the official trusted mechanic for the network. Northern and Central California chapters." He paused. "Not a preferred shop, not a recommended shop. Official, meaning when there is work to be done, it comes here first. Meaning when there is a question about a bike's condition, this is where the answer comes from." Another pause. "And meaning the network stands behind this shop. Its debts are cleared, its equipment is brought current. Whatever it needs to operate properly, it gets." The room absorbed this. Caleb said, "I haven't agreed to what Grip and I discussed earlier." "I know," Crowley said. "I'm not asking you to agree to anything tonight. I'm telling you what I've decided. What you decide about your shop is still yours to decide. He looked at Caleb with the directness that was apparently just how he communicated. But I want you to know what's on the table, fully, not hints, not implications, the whole thing. Caleb looked at Grip. Grip said, he means it exactly as he said it. I know, Caleb said. He looked at the knucklehead in the lot, and he thought about Raymond, who had done work for the chapter 20 years ago, and had charged them fair and done it right, and not made a thing of who they were. And he thought about what it meant to be that kind of shop, the kind where the work was the thing, where the standards were the standards, regardless of who was watching. He thought about whether that was what this was, and whether he could make it be that, and whether the thing being offered was the thing it appeared to be. Let me sleep on it, he said. Crowley nodded. That's the right answer, he said, which was the second time today someone had told him that, and both times it had been for the same reason: he'd refused to decide something important in a hurry. At 12:31, Grip's phone rang, and he looked at the screen and looked at Garrett and said one word. Now. Garrett went outside. Briggs went outside. 3 others followed. Caleb looked at Darnell, and Darnell looked back at him with an expression that said he didn't know either, and they both waited. Nothing happened for 4 minutes. The garage was quiet. Reardon packed his notepad and recorder and laptop into his bag with the methodical patience of a man completing a task that has taken all day and is almost done. Crowley stood in the lot, visible through the bay door beside his knucklehead, looking south down the street. And then Caleb heard it. He heard it before he understood it. The same deep synchronized rumble he'd heard 13 hours ago when the convoy first rounded the corner, but different in scale, bigger, fuller, layered the sound of not 14 bikes, but something far beyond that felt in the floor, felt in the workbench under his hands, felt in the chest before it properly reached the ears. He walked to the bay door. He stood beside Crowley and looked south. They came around the corner the same way the first convoy had come in formation. Clean and deliberate, one behind the other, and then 2 abreast, and then 3, and they kept coming. They came without noise beyond the engines, no calls, no horns, no theater of any kind. They rolled into the lot and positioned themselves in rows, and the rows filled, and still they kept coming, spilling out of the lot onto the street in both directions, rank after rank of men on motorcycles who had ridden however far they'd ridden tonight to be in this specific place at this specific moment. And they came in silence, and they stopped in silence. And when they were stopped, the sound of the engines cutting off happened in sequence, one after another, until the last one cut, and the street was completely quiet. Caleb stood in the bay door and counted and lost count and started again. 398 motorcycles. He knew the number because Grip said it, coming to stand beside him, his voice for the first time all day, carrying something that wasn't flat or calibrated. Something that was actually feeling. 398, Grip said. Every chapter that could get here tonight. Some of them drove 4 hours. Caleb couldn't speak for a moment. Why, he said. It wasn't the most articulate question he'd ever asked, but it was the honest one. Because word travels, Grip said. What happened here today, what you found, what you did, what it means for the men whose names were on Keel's list that travels fast in this world. And when something is worth acknowledging, we acknowledge it. He paused. This is acknowledgement. Caleb looked at 398 men on motorcycles sitting in silence in his lot and on his street, and understood that he was looking at something he was never going to be able to fully explain to anyone who hadn't seen it. And that was all right, because some things didn't need explaining to be real. Iron Jack Crowley walked out into the lot. He walked to the center of it, among the rows of bikes and the men on them, and he stood there and looked around at all of them, and what passed between Crowley and those 398 men was not words. It was recognition. It was the acknowledgement of something survived, something exposed, something that had been aimed at the heart of what they were and had been stopped by a 19-year-old mechanic with a magnifying glass and his dead uncle's standards. Then Crowley did something Caleb didn't expect. He turned and pointed at Caleb. And the silence held for one more second, one enormous weighted second, and then the engines started. Not all at once, not in a roar, but in a rolling wave that began at the front of the lot and moved backward through the rows, bike by bike, engine by engine, each one turning over and settling into its idle until the full 398 were running. And the sound of it was not thunder, it was not a threat, it was not anything that language had a perfect word for, but it filled the street, in the lot, in the garage, in Caleb's chest, and it said everything that the silence before it had been holding. Darnell appeared at Caleb's shoulder. The older man looked out at the lot and at the sea of running engines, and he pressed his lips together hard and looked at the sky for a moment, the way people look at the sky when they are keeping something from coming out of their eyes. Raymond, he said. Just the name, to nobody in particular, or to the night, or to the calendar on the wall behind them, with the star drawn next to a date in a pen, long dry. Caleb didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Yesha. The bikes began to leave at 12:53 in the same orderly sequence. They'd arrived row by row. No rush, no drama. The whole operation conducted with the same quiet discipline that had characterized the entire day from the moment the first convoy had rolled in that morning. They went south mostly and east, dispersing back into the California night, toward wherever they'd come from, 4 hours of riding, ahead of some of them, less for others, and they went without stopping to talk or linger because the thing they'd come to do was done. By 1:15, the lot was clear, except for Grip's Road, King Crowley's truck, Rearon's sedan, and the knucklehead. By 1:32, Rearon had gone shaking Caleb's hand at the door with a grip that was firmer than it needed to be, and held a moment longer than handshakes usually did, which said everything Rearon wasn't going to say out loud. Briggs and Garrett left together, Briggs lifting a hand to Caleb on the way out without turning around. The kind of farewell that meant something between men who don't make a habit of demonstrating that things mean something. Manny Reyes stopped at the bay door on his way out. He looked at Caleb and looked like he was going to say something significant and then thought better of it, which was probably the right call. Instead, he said, "Good work today." And Caleb said, "Take care of yourself, Manny." And Manny nodded and went. Grip was the last of them, and before he left, he stood in front of Caleb one final time and looked at him with the oil-dark eyes that had been assessing him since 8 in the morning. "The offer stands," he said. "No rush, no pressure. When you know what you want, you know where to find us." "Yes, sir," Caleb said. Grip looked at the garage one more time at Raymond's equipment, at the calendar at the knucklehead still in the lot. "Clean it up right," he said. "This is a good shop." He rode out. And then it was just Crowley and Caleb and Darnell in the lot. The night fully arrived, the street quiet in the way streets got quiet after something large had moved through them and left. Crowley put his hand on the knucklehead's tank one last time, the gesture that had become over the course of the day, his particular way of reestablishing the connection between himself and the machine. Not possessive, more like checking in, like touching the hand of someone you thought you'd lost. "The memorial run is Saturday," he said. 7 a.m. departure from the staging area off Shields Avenue. He looked at Caleb. "I'd like you there, not as a mechanic, not on call, just there, to see it move." Caleb thought about the envelope in his back pocket. He thought about the federal evidence examination scheduled for day after tomorrow. He thought about the $800 a month he'd been losing and the weight of it, and the way that weight had felt different by the end of the day than it had felt at the beginning of it. He thought about Raymond's calendar and the star next to a date he couldn't read. "Yes, sir," he said. "I'll be there." Crowley nodded. He started the knucklehead third kick tonight, the engine cold now, and let it idle for 30 seconds, and then he rode out of the lot slowly. Not performing or just moving the machine, doing what it was built to do with the man who was built to ride it. And the sound of the knucklehead going up the street was different from every other engine sound Caleb had heard all night, because he knew every inch of what made it, and it was right. He listened to it until he couldn't hear it anymore. Darnell locked the bay door. Caleb turned off the overheads and left the work lights on the low amber glow that Raymond had always left running overnight, a habit from so long ago that neither of them knew the original reason for it, and neither of them would ever turn it off. They stood in the lot. Caleb pulled the envelope from his back pocket. He opened it. He looked at the number on the check inside for a long time. Then he folded it back up and put it away. "Well," Darnell said. "We're not 800 behind anymore," Caleb said. Darnell breathed out slowly. "How far ahead are we?" "Far enough to fix the equipment. Far enough to pay forward 6 months." He put the envelope in his shirt pocket. "Far enough to do this right." Darnell looked at the lot where 398 bikes had stood an hour ago, and looked at the garage that had held all of it, and looked at Caleb, and he did the thing Caleb had seen him do only twice before, once when Raymond got his first real contract, and once at Raymond's funeral, which was let his face do exactly what it was going to do without trying to manage it. Your uncle built something worth building, Darnell said. Yeah, Caleb said. He did. So did you. Today. Caleb didn't deflect it. He let it be true because it was, and because Raymond had taught him that deflecting true things was its own kind of dishonesty. We both did, he said. You stayed. Where was I going to go, Darnell said. And he meant it fully and without performance the way he meant most things. They stood there a moment longer in the quiet lot. Caleb looked at the spot where the knucklehead had been all day, the specific patch of a concrete that still held a faint oil, traced the ghost of the machine that had started everything. He looked at the bay door, at the work lights inside amber and steady, the same light they'd always been. His phone buzzed. He looked at it, expecting nothing, and found something he hadn't expected, a text from a number he now recognized as Raren's. Cho confirmed, all 6 in custody, no complications. Good night, Mr. Ward. Caleb showed it to Darnell. Darnell read it, handed the phone back. All 6, he said. All 6, Caleb said. They stood with that for a moment, and it was not a small thing to stand with 6 men who had designed the deaths of 4 others now in federal custody, the mechanism of what they'd planned dismantled by a magnifying glass and a TIG welder, and the refusal of a 19-year-old to look at something and see anything other than what was actually there. Go home, Darnell said. Sleep, come back tomorrow, and we'll talk about what comes next. You go first, Caleb said. I want a few minutes. Darnell looked at him, assessing in the way he always assessed, not suspicious. Just careful, the way you were careful with people you actually cared about. Then he nodded. Lock up, right. Always, Caleb said. Darnell's truck started and pulled out, and the sound of it faded, and Caleb Ward stood alone in his uncle's lot in the quiet of 1:40 in the morning, 19 years old, with grease permanently in the lines of his knuckles, and a federal case number and a text on his phone, and a check in his shirt pocket that changed what tomorrow looked like. He thought about the voice on the phone that afternoon. The calm voice working at calm. The offer of money. The assumption that a struggling kid with a failing shop was a manageable problem. Something that could be redirected with the right incentive. He thought about how certain that voice had been, and how wrong. He thought about what Manny had said, you didn't hesitate, and he thought about whether that was true and decided that it was, and that the reason it was true was not complicated. You hesitated when you weren't sure what was right. He'd been sure. The work was right. The truth was right. Telling the truth about what the work showed him was right. There was no point in the day where those 3 things had been in conflict, so there had been no point in the day where he'd had to choose. That was Raymond. That was what Raymond had built in him over years of standing beside a man who held the same standard on the smallest job as on the largest, who treated a $40 oil change with the same honesty as a full engine rebuild, who never once, not in Caleb's memory, said what someone wanted to hear instead of what was true. He looked up at the sky above the lot, the Central Valley sky that held so many stars on clear nights, that it felt excessive, like more than the dark needed, and he said, I heard you, Uncle Ray, the whole time. The night didn't answer. It didn't need to. He went back inside, he turned off the work lights. He locked the bay door with the key that had been Raymond's and was his, now the key that unlocked a place where things got fixed and the truth got told, and the work was always worth doing right. Saturday morning, the memorial run went off exactly as planned, 200 miles Highway 99 to Bakersfield, and back under a clean California sky with Iron Jack Crowley at the front of the line on a 1947 Harley knucklehead that ran like a clock and rode like a prayer. Caleb Ward stood at the staging area off Shields Avenue and watched them go, all of them, 398 bikes moving south in the morning light, and he felt the rumble of them move through the ground and up through his feet and into his chest where it settled and stayed. Darnell stood beside him with a coffee, said nothing. They watched until the last bike disappeared into the horizon. That was the day Caleb Ward stopped being the kid in the shop. He was the man who had seen what trained professionals missed, told the truth when silence was easier, held the line when money was offered to move it, and rebuilt what had been made to kill into something that carried the living forward. And in a world built entirely on silence and loyalty, that was the only kind of miracle that actually lasted.